What you're about to see will change how you think about medieval justice forever. These aren't just stories from history books, these are real execution methods so horrifying that even the brutal medieval world eventually said, enough. I'm going to show you 5 execution methods so savage, they were banned not because they didn't work, but because they worked too well. You think you know about medieval brutality? You think you've seen the worst humanity has to offer? Think again. What I'm about to reveal goes beyond anything you've seen in movies or read in books. These methods were so disturbing that chroniclers of the time often refused to write about them in detail. Before we dive into this dark chapter of human history, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because this content isn't for the faint of heart. And trust me, by the end of this video, you'll understand why these methods were so feared that just mentioning them could make hardened criminals confess. But first, let me set the stage. Medieval justice wasn't about rehabilitation or even simple punishment. It was about creating such fear that crime would be deterred entirely. Public executions were entertainment, but more than that, they were psychological warfare against potential criminals. The methods I'm about to describe weren't aberrations, they were the logical extreme of a justice system that believed suffering was not just acceptable, but necessary. Each method was designed with one goal: to make death as terrifying and painful as possible. Let's start with number 5, and warning, it only gets worse from here. Picture this, ancient Sicily, 6th century BC, but used throughout medieval Europe. A bronze bull, beautiful on the outside, but hiding the most diabolical secret. This wasn't just an execution, it was a performance. The brazen bull looked like a work of art, polished bronze, intricate designs, admired by spectators who had no idea they were looking at the most sophisticated torture device ever created. The victim was locked inside this hollow bronze bull through a door in the side, and then a fire was lit underneath. But here's the truly sick part: as the person inside screamed in agony, the bull was designed with special acoustic chambers that made their scream sound like a bull's roar. The engineering was diabolical. Someone spent months perfecting the acoustic design to make sure the scream sounded exactly right. The inventor, Perillos of Athens, thought he was creating the perfect gift for the tyrant Phalaris. But plot twist, Phalaris was so disgusted by the invention that he made Perillos the first victim of his own creation. Even ancient tyrants had limits. But here's what's really chilling: Phalaris didn't destroy the bull after killing its inventor. He kept it and used it for years as the centerpiece of his reign of terror. The psychological impact was devastating. Spectators heard what sounded like an angry bull, not human suffering. It completely dehumanized the victim. The method was so revolting that it was banned across most of Europe by the 12th century. What finally ended its use wasn't humanitarian concern, it was the realization that it was creating more criminals than it was deterring. If you thought the brazen bull was bad, wait until you hear about flaying. This method was so brutal that even Game of Thrones couldn't show it accurately on screen. Flaying meant skinning someone alive, and medieval executioners had turned it into a precise, horrifying art form. The executioners who specialized in this were often former physicians who understood anatomy and knew exactly how to keep someone alive while removing their skin. They would start at the extremities, carefully removing skin in strips while keeping the victim conscious as long as possible. The process could take anywhere from several hours to several days, depending on the executioner's skill and the victim's constitution. The most famous case was Sisamnes, a corrupt Persian judge. When King Cambyses discovered his bribery, he ordered Sisamnes flayed alive. But here's the twisted part: the king had the skin made into strips and used them to cover the judge's throne. Then he appointed the judge's son to sit on his father's skin as a reminder of what happens to corrupt officials. The Assyrians were particularly fond of this method and would display the flayed skin of enemy leaders on city walls. They developed techniques for preserving the skin so it would last for years as a permanent warning. What made flaying so psychologically devastating was that it could take hours or even days. The victim would remain conscious through most of the ordeal, watching their own skin being removed piece by piece until they were no longer recognizable as human. The practice was largely abandoned by the 11th century, even hardened medieval warriors found it too disturbing. What finally ended its use was the realization that it was creating more enemies than it was eliminating. Now we enter Viking territory, and trust me, the Norse didn't do anything halfway. The blood eagle was reserved for the most hated enemies, and it was designed to be both execution and religious ritual. The Vikings believed that how you died determined where you would spend eternity. The blood eagle was designed to give even the most despised enemy a chance at a glorious death, if they could endure it without screaming. Picture this: the victim is placed face down, and the executioner cuts through the ribs on both sides of the spine. Then, and this is where it gets truly horrific, the ribs are pulled back and spread apart like wings. The lungs are then pulled out and laid on the victim's back, creating the appearance of bloody wings. This wasn't just torture, it was a sacred ritual dedicated to Odin. The victim was being transformed into a raven, Odin's sacred bird. The spread ribs represented wings, and the ceremony would begin hours before the actual execution with ritual preparation. But here's what made it truly psychological torture: the victim had to remain silent throughout the entire process. If you screamed or showed fear, you'd be denied entry to Valhalla. So victims would often bite their tongues literally to prevent themselves from crying out. The most famous victim was supposedly King Aella of Northumbria, who was given the blood eagle by the sons of Ragnar Lodbrok in revenge for their father's death. According to the saga, Aella remained silent throughout the entire ordeal, earning his place in Valhalla. The practice died out by the 11th century as Christianity spread through Scandinavia. Even the Vikings eventually realized that some traditions were too savage for a civilizing world. What I'm about to describe was considered so inhumane that even other ancient civilizations refused to use it. The Persians called it the boats, but history knows it as scaphism, and it might be the most psychologically disturbing execution method ever devised. Here's how it worked: the victim was trapped between two small boats or hollowed-out tree trunks, with only their head, hands, and feet sticking out. They were then force-fed milk and honey until they developed severe diarrhea. But that was just the beginning. The victim was then covered in more honey and set afloat on a stagnant pond. The honey would attract insects, first flies, then wasps, then beetles, and eventually much worse things. The victim would be kept alive with regular feedings of milk and honey, prolonging the agony indefinitely. The genius of this method was its use of nature itself as the executioner. The authorities didn't have to do anything after the initial setup, they just had to wait and watch as nature took its course. The historical account of Mithridates describes how he survived this torture for 17 days. Think about that, 17 days of conscious suffering. Insects would lay eggs in his body, maggots would develop, and he would slowly be consumed alive while remaining fully aware. The smell would attract larger scavengers, rats, then larger animals. The victim would watch as their own body became a breeding ground for insects while remaining conscious through most of it. What made scaphism so effective wasn't just the physical torture, it was the helplessness. The victim couldn't move, couldn't defend themselves, couldn't even die quickly. They were forced to experience every moment of their slow consumption. The method was so revolting that it was banned even in ancient Persia by the 4th century BC. No civilization since has been willing to officially adopt it. And now, the execution method so brutal, so psychologically devastating, that it was banned across all of medieval Europe by the 14th century. The Judas cradle, also known as the Judas chair, was the ultimate torture device disguised as an execution method. Picture a pyramid-shaped wooden or metal point, mounted on a chair or platform. The victim would be positioned over this point and slowly lowered onto it. But here's the truly diabolical part: the executioner could control every aspect of the process. The device was engineered with scientific precision. The pyramid point was carefully calculated to cause maximum pain without immediate death. The victim could spend hours, sometimes days, slowly being impaled. The executioner would add weights to speed up the process or remove them to slow it down. They could stop the descent entirely to prolong the agony, or apply pressure to specific body parts to increase the pain. The device was often used as both execution method and interrogation tool. What made the Judas cradle so psychologically devastating was the anticipation. Unlike other execution methods that were over quickly, this one gave the victim time to contemplate every moment of their approaching death. The victim would be positioned above the point and left there for hours, sometimes days, knowing that at any moment they could be lowered to their death. The device was named after Judas Iscariot, implying that this was the fate reserved for the ultimate betrayers. It was used primarily during the Spanish Inquisition, where the threat of the cradle was often enough to extract confessions. Some victims would beg for traditional execution methods instead. The waiting was often worse than the actual execution, the psychological torture of knowing exactly what was going to happen and being powerless to stop it. By 1348, the device was banned in most European countries. Even medieval justice, which wasn't known for its mercy, recognized that some methods crossed the line from execution into pure sadism. These 5 execution methods represent the darkest chapter in human justice. They weren't just about ending a life, they were about inflicting maximum suffering, creating public spectacles, and using fear as a tool of control. What's remarkable is that even medieval societies, which accepted violence as part of daily life, eventually recognized that these methods went too far. They were banned not because they didn't work, but because they revealed something too dark about human nature. The fact that we've moved beyond these methods shows that humanity, despite its dark history, can progress towards something better. But remembering these methods ensures we never forget how far we've come, and how far we can fall. If this video disturbed you, good, it should. But if you want to see more dark history content, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. And let me know in the comments, which of these methods did you find most disturbing?